They found my daughter with fractures across both arms, and the man who did it walked free by sundown. He didn't run, he didn't hide. One phone call, and he decided nothing had ever happened to her. Everyone told me the law belonged to him now. They were wrong. I'd spent 30 years learning what a jury believes, and I was coming for everything he buried. I am going to tell you how it stopped working. My name is Solomon Vance. I keep bees for a living, or I did before I retired and kept them out of habit instead. Bees do not lie to you. A hive tells you exactly what is happening inside it if you know how to read the hum. People are harder. I spent 30 years learning how to read people too, mostly in courtrooms testifying about property lines and land disputes, because I happened to know more about bee flight patterns than most surveyors. Once in a dispute over 60 acres outside Dunlap, I proved a fence line had been moved 11 years earlier by showing the court where 3 generations of my hives had foraged season after season, because bees do not change their routes for a new property stake. The judge ruled in my client's favor. I thought that was the strangest thing I would ever be asked to prove in front of a jury. I was wrong about that too. It started with a phone call at 2 in the morning. My grandson Emmett was 12 years old, and his voice on the other end of the line did not sound 12. It sounded like a boy trying to be a man because nobody else in the house was available to do it. "Grandpa, Mom won't wake up. There's blood on the kitchen floor." I was already reaching for my truck keys before he finished the sentence. My wife Opal was already pulling a coat over her nightgown. Neither of us said much on the drive to Sequatchie County Medical. There was nothing useful to say yet. We didn't have the facts, and I have never been a man who talks before he has the facts. Bram was standing at the emergency entrance when we pulled in. My son-in-law. He had his hands in his jacket pockets, and his face arranged into something that was supposed to look like worry. I have watched juries for 30 years. I know what a rehearsed expression looks like, and that was one. He raised a hand when our headlights swept across him, small, controlled like a man greeting neighbors at a funeral he didn't cause. "Solomon, Opal, thank God you're here." She fell down the back steps, he said, before either of us asked him anything. Middle of the night. I heard the noise and found her at the bottom. I already called it in. "Called what in?" I said. "The fall," he said. "To the department. So there's a record." I did not answer him. Opal's fingers found my arm and held on hard enough to leave a mark later. We walked past him into the building, and the doors closed behind us, and the smell hit both of us at once. The particular smell of a night that has already gone wrong before you know the details. A doctor met us before we reached the front desk. Dr. Colette Okonkwo. Dark hair pulled back, a hospital badge clipped to green scrubs, and the specific stillness of a person who has learned that stillness is the only kindness left to offer at 2 in the morning. She said our names. She said she needed to speak with us before we saw Corinne. We followed her into a small room with 4 chairs and a box of tissues nobody had touched yet. She did not sit down. She stood with her hands folded and chose her words the way a person tests ice before stepping onto it. "Your daughter has sustained a fracture to her left forearm and a fracture to her right wrist," she said. Both injuries occurred within the same incident. But I want you to understand something before you see her. The forearm fracture shows a hairline stress pattern consistent with a defensive posture. Someone raising an arm to block a blow. Opal made a sound beside me that I had never heard her make before. "I need you to hear the rest," Dr. Okonkwo said. "There is bruising on her ribs in 3 stages of healing. Days old, weeks old, longer than that. This is not one fall down a set of porch steps, Mr. Vance. This is not one accident on one bad night." I asked the only question that mattered. How many times? She looked at me steadily, the way you look at someone when you are about to hand them something heavy and you cannot make it lighter, no matter how you phrase it. I count at least 4 separate incidents based on the healing stages alone, she said. Possibly more. She turned a folder toward us and pointed to a line of dates written in her own hand. One set of rib injuries dates to roughly 8 months ago. A second set to 5 months ago. A third more recent, perhaps 6 weeks. Tonight makes 4. This is a pattern. I want it documented exactly the way I am telling you, she said. Not softened. Not summarized as a fall. I will not write accidental trauma on a chart that does not support it, no matter who asks me to. Who would ask you to? I said. She did not answer that question. Not yet. She only held my eyes for a moment longer than the question required, and then she closed the folder. I stood very still. I did not say anything for a moment, because I have learned over 35 years of watching people process bad news that the first thing you feel is rarely the thing you should say out loud. Behind me, through the glass panel of the door, I could see Bram in the waiting room, sitting with his phone in his hand, his thumb moving across the screen like a man with nothing on his mind but the weather. He had already decided how this story would end. He did not know I keep bees. He did not know that a man who spends 30 years reading hives, reading courtrooms, reading the small tells that separate the truth from a story, someone rehearsed in a bathroom mirror, does not walk away from a pattern once he sees one. This wasn't one fall. This was a pattern. And patterns, in my experience, always tell you where to look next. Detective Silas Wren had already read 3 prior reports on my daughter before he said a single word to me that night. 3 calls to that address over the better part of a year, and not one of them had ever reached a supervisor who wanted the truth more than he wanted a quiet Friday. I did not know that yet. I was still sitting in a plastic chair in a hospital waiting room, watching my son-in-law check his phone like a man waiting on a table at a restaurant. "Sit down, Bram," I said, "and don't talk to me." He looked up. Something moved behind his eyes, quick, recalculating the look of a man adjusting an approach when the first version hasn't landed. He sat down without another word. I crossed the room to where Emmett was folded into a corner chair, knees pulled to his chest, bare feet tucked underneath him. He flinched when I put my hand on his shoulder. A full flinch, the kind that tells you more than any sentence could. "Grandpa," he said, "is Mom going to die?" "No," I told him. "She's going to wake up, and she is going to want strong coffee and better company than a hospital waiting room, and we are going to be here when that happens." His chin crumpled. He pressed his face into my shoulder, and I let him cry the way a boy cries when he has been holding it since long before he ever picked up a phone. When it passed, I kept my arm around him. "Was this the first time you thought about calling someone?" I asked him. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "No. I picked up the phone 3 times tonight before I called you. I put it down 3 times. Why," I said, "Dad said if I ever called anyone, they'd take me away, put me in foster care. He said people who show up when you call, they break up families. He said it was always better to keep things inside the house." I kept my hands steady on his shoulders, because he needed them steady more than he needed to see what I was actually feeling. "But then your mom stopped making sounds," I said, "and you called anyway." He nodded against my arm. "I thought if something happened to her and I didn't call, I would never forgive myself. I couldn't." "You saved her life tonight," I said. "Do you understand that? Whatever your father told you, whatever you were afraid of, none of that matters right now. You did exactly the right thing." That was when the door to the waiting room opened, and a heavy-set man in a sport coat that had seen better years walked in with a paper cup of coffee gripped like it was the only warm thing left in the building. His eyes moved to Bram first, then to me. Then he tilted his head toward the hallway. I settled Emmett back into his chair and followed the man out. He stopped near a supply closet, his back against the wall, both hands wrapped around the cup. Up close, he looked worse than he had across the room. "Mr. Vance," he said, "I'm Detective Silas Wren. I've been assigned to your daughter's case tonight, and I'm about to tell you something I probably shouldn't, and I need you to hear it without walking back into that room and doing something we both can't undo. I taught expert testimony to judges for 3 decades," I said. "I know how to listen before I act." He exhaled through his nose. "I've also read the file," he said. 3 prior domestic calls to that address. A neighbor complaint 14 months ago, logged and closed. A wellness check requested by someone at your daughter's church 6 months back. Officer responded, noted no immediate danger, file closed. And an ER visit 8 months ago. Your daughter came in with a fractured wrist. Said she slipped on wet tile. No follow-up ordered. "Who requested the wellness check?" I asked. "The file doesn't say a name," he said. "Just a note. Concerned party from congregation." Whoever it was, the responding officer spent 11 minutes at the house and left without asking your daughter a single question out of your son-in-law's hearing. That's standard protocol violation right there, and nobody flagged it. "And the ER visit," I said. "Attending physician noted the wrist fracture was, quote, consistent with reported mechanism of injury. Nobody cross-referenced it against the neighbor complaint filed 6 months earlier. Different officer took that report. Different shift. Nobody in that department talks to each other unless Holloway decides they should." "Who closed them?" I said. His jaw worked for a moment before the words came out. "Sergeant Dean Holloway, Bram's direct supervisor. They've known each other since college. Holloway still calls him Kess, even on shift, like they're 22 years old, and none of this is real. If I write tonight's report and send it up the normal channel, it lands on Holloway's desk. And it closes exactly like the other 3 did. So you're telling me," I said, and my voice came out quieter than I expected, "that this has happened multiple times before and people knew and nothing was done." "That is exactly what I'm telling you," he said. "And I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry. But if you go in loud tonight, if you make accusations through the normal channels in this county, they will write the story for you before you get a chance to write it yourself. Grieving family. Difficult situation. Nothing to see here." I looked at him for a moment, without answering, because I had already started thinking somewhere between the waiting room and this hallway, and the thinking had arrived somewhere clear and cold. "Why are you telling me this?" I said. "You could have handed me the official version and gone back to your coffee." "I could have," he said. His throat moved. "I've got a daughter, too. She's 9. She still thinks I can fix anything. Someday she's going to find out I can't. But I want to be able to look at her and know that when it mattered, I did the right thing. Even if it's just this much." He held up his thumb and forefinger barely a centimeter apart. I nodded once. "Thank you, Roy," I started to say, and caught myself because that was not his name, and he noticed the slip and something almost like a tired smile crossed his face before it disappeared again. "Silas," I said instead. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "Go be with your family. And Mr. Vance, whatever you're about to do it quietly and do it fast." Pastor Ambrose Tull had known for 11 months. He was standing on my porch before 9 the next morning, hat in both hands, already carrying words he should have said to me a year earlier. I did not know that yet either. I was still in the bee shed at 7 alone with a notebook open in front of me and a pencil in my hand, trying to decide what the first sentence should be. I had kept records my whole working life. Bee counts, foraging patterns, expert testimony written out longhand before I ever said a word of it in a courtroom. I reached up onto the shelf above my workbench and took down an old brood frame cracked along one edge, saved from my very first hive 40 years back. I do not know why I picked it up that morning. I set it on the bench beside the notebook and looked at it for a moment. Then I opened to the first blank page and wrote one word at the top: Bram. Below it, the date. Below that, I started writing everything Silas Wren had told me word for word, the way I used to transcribe testimony before a hearing. 3 reports. Sergeant Dean Holloway. 9 years, same badge number, same college roommate. I wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. Opal came out to the shed with 2 cups of coffee, one for her, one for me, and set mine down without a word. She sat on the stool across from the workbench and watched me write for a while before she spoke. I keep thinking about something she said. Back in the spring at Wednesday prayer group, Corinne asked us to pray for, quote, patience in her marriage and strength to handle stress at home. I remember thinking it was an odd thing to ask for out loud in front of everyone. I asked her about it afterward, and she just said work had been hard on both of them. I did not say anything. I picked up the pencil again and drew a line under the word Bram hard enough that it nearly tore the page. You think that meant something, I said. It wasn't a question. Did she say anything else that week, I asked. Anything at all? Opal thought about it, turning her mug slowly on the table. She missed the potluck the following Sunday, she said. Said she had a headache. That wasn't like her. She never missed a potluck, not since she was a girl, helping me carry the casserole dishes in. And 2 weeks after that, she wore a long-sleeve blouse to the 4th of July cookout. 96 degrees, and she wore long sleeves and laughed it off when someone asked if she was cold. I did not say anything. 40 years, and I had never once fixed that crack. I had told myself if it still held honey fine that a small flaw in an old frame didn't matter as long as the bees kept working around it. I set the pencil down. I think a lot of things that seemed small at the time are going to look different by the end of the week, I said. That was when we heard a car pull into the driveway, and a few minutes later, a knock at the front door. Pastor Tull was standing on the porch when I opened it, turning his hat slowly by the brim over and over, the particular motion of a man who has been rehearsing something all night and still isn't sure it's enough. He had worn a wedding ring for 40 years before his wife passed, and he still turned it out of habit even now that the ring was gone, his thumb circling an empty groove on his finger that only he could feel. Solomon, he said. I heard. I should have called first, but I needed to come in person. Come in, Ambrose, I said. There's coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. He wrapped both hands around the mug and stared into it for a long moment before he spoke. I owe you something, he said. I've owed it to you for 11 months, and I've been a coward about it, and I am done being a coward. I waited. Corinne came to see me 11 months ago, he said. She sat down in my office and didn't say a word for almost 10 minutes. Just sat there with her hands folded in her lap. I asked her if something was wrong at home. She looked at me for a long moment, like she was deciding something. Then she said, "Never mind, Pastor, I'm fine." And she stood up and walked out. The words landed in the kitchen, like something dropped from a height. "Why are you telling me this now?" I said. "Because I should have called you 11 months ago," he said, and his voice cracked hard on the last word. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself she hadn't actually said anything, not really. So there was nothing to report. I told myself Bram was a respected man in this county, an officer of the court, and if something was truly wrong, someone with authority would already know about it. He pressed his lips together. 3 reports got filed, Solomon. I found that out this morning, same as you're about to. 3 reports, and every single one of them got closed. And I sat in my own church for 11 months, telling myself that silence was the same thing as not knowing. "Did you tell anyone?" I asked him. "Anyone at all?" He shook his head slowly. "No." I told myself it wasn't mine to tell. I nearly called your wife twice that first month. I got as far as dialing the first 6 digits once sitting in my study, and then I hung up and told myself I was overreacting to 10 minutes of silence in an office. Has anything like this happened before in this congregation? I asked. Anyone else you've watched walk out a door? He was quiet for a moment. Once he said, years back. A young woman came to see me, similar circumstances, though I didn't understand that at the time either. I told her to pray about her marriage and gave her a pamphlet on strengthening the family. She stopped coming to services altogether about 4 months later. I never followed up. I told myself people leave churches for all kinds of reasons. You think it was the same reason I said, I think he said, and stopped. I think I have spent a long career mistaking my own comfort for patience, Solomon. I think I called it waiting on the Lord's timing, when really I was just waiting for someone else to do the hard part. Something moved through me at that cold and quiet, because I recognized the shape of it. I had a notebook open in my own shed not 2 hours earlier, and I had told myself I was documenting being careful, gathering facts before I moved. It was not so different a sentence from his. She sat in my office for 10 minutes and said nothing. He said again, quieter now, like the second telling cost him more than the first. Then she stood up and said, never mind. And I let her walk out that door. Marisol Reyes opened her door before I had finished knocking, which told me Pastor Tull had already called ahead. She was a small woman in her mid-60s, silver threaded through dark hair, pulled back tight. Her eyes taking me in from the porch steps to my collar before she stepped aside to let me through. Mr. Vance, she said, come in, please. Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee left too long on the burner. She poured a cup without asking whether I wanted one and set it in front of me, then sat across the small table with her own mug wrapped in both hands. Her eyes steady on mine in a way that told me she had been waiting for this conversation longer than she wanted to admit. How is she? Marisol asked. Stable, I said. She hasn't woken up yet. Her eyes closed for a moment. When she opened them again, something in her face had settled into place, the look of a woman who had decided somewhere between the phone call and this pot of coffee exactly how honest she was willing to be. What do you need to know? She said. Everything you saw. Everything you heard. Start wherever you need to. She took a long breath and let it out slow. The first year they lived next door. Bram fixed my fence after that storm we had back in March. Didn't ask, didn't wait for me to bring it up. Just showed up one Saturday with tools and spent half the day out there in the heat. She looked down into her mug. He used to bring Corinne flowers every Friday. I'd see him pull in from work with a little bunch of daisies from the gas station, and 20 minutes later I'd hear her laughing about something through the kitchen window. That's real, Mr. Vance. Whatever else is true now, that part was real once. I did not say anything. I had learned over 3 decades of taking testimony that silence pulled more truth out of a person than any question could. That stopped, she said. I know almost exactly when. It was the week after he got passed over for the assistant chief position at the department. Everyone on this street heard about it before he did, if you want to know the truth. Small county, everybody's cousin works dispatch. Tell me about the change, I said, my pencil already moving. It wasn't one day, she said. It was gradual, like a dimmer switch turned down a little at a time so you don't notice the room's gone dark until you're already sitting in it. First, it was just noise, raised voices late at night. I told myself couples argue that's normal, none of my business. Then his patrol shifts changed later hours, and I started noticing his truck in the driveway at odd times during the day when it should have been at the department. Twice I saw him sitting in it in the driveway for 20 minutes or more before he ever went inside, like he was working up to something, or working himself down from something. I never knew which. Then one morning I saw Corinne out at the mailbox in a long sleeve shirt. July, Mr. Vance. 101 degrees on the porch thermometer. She waved at me and smiled and went back inside before I could say a word. Her eyes filled, and she pressed her lips together hard, refusing to let the tears go any further than that. I should have walked over there, she said. I should have knocked on that door and asked her straight out. Why didn't you? I asked. Not accusing. I needed to understand it the way I needed to understand every gap in every account before I could trust the whole of it. Because Bram knew everyone on this street, she said. Every neighbor, every dog's name, every family's schedule. He'd been community liaison for this whole district for 6 years before the demotion. He knew who worked nights and who was home during the day, and who kept a spare key under which planter. He made it clear, without ever saying it outright, that he was not a man you wanted to create problems for. And we were afraid. I'm not proud of it. But it's the truth. You're not afraid now, I said. No, she said, and her chin came up an inch. I am done being afraid. What do you need from me? A written statement, I told her. Your name on it. Every date you remember, every detail, everything you saw or heard that felt wrong, even the parts that seemed small at the time. Give me your notebook, she said. I slid it across the table. She picked up my pencil and began to write dates and times and specific incidents in a clear, careful hand that surprised me with its precision. When she caught me noticing something close to a dry smile crossed her face. I was an office manager for 22 years before I retired, she said. I know how to document a thing properly. She glanced toward a shelf on the far wall lined with small tins. I still keep every old stamp I ever bought and never used, dated on the back in pencil the day I bought them. 22 years of habits don't just leave you because you stopped getting a paycheck for them. I used to open a drawer and know the exact day. That habit is going to matter a great deal, I told her, and I meant it. We worked for the better part of an hour. When she finally slid the notebook back across the table, 4 pages were filled in her handwriting, a record covering 14 months of what she had watched happen 12 feet away through a shared fence line, the same fence Bram had mended with his own hands the first year they moved in. I was closing the notebook when she said, "Before you go, there's something else I need to tell you." I looked up. Corinne came to see me about 3 months ago, she said. Not to talk, just to ask a favor. She told me, and I remember her exact words. She said, Marisol, if anything ever happens to me and my father comes asking questions, give this to him. My throat tightened. I didn't ask what it was, Marisol said. I didn't open it. I just kept it exactly where she told me to keep it, and I hoped I would never have to hand it to anybody. She stood up and crossed to the drawer beside her stove, her hand resting on the handle for a moment, before she pulled it open. There's one more thing, Mr. Vance, she said, her back still to me. She gave me something to keep. The envelope was small sealed and had my name written across the front in handwriting I would have known anywhere, even after all these years, even smaller and tighter than it used to be. I did not open it in Marisol's kitchen. I put it in my jacket pocket, thanked her twice, and drove home with one hand on the wheel and the other resting flat against my chest over the pocket, the way you check that something is still there without meaning to. The drive took 11 minutes. I know because I counted them the way I had started counting most things since 2 o'clock the previous morning. Somewhere around the 4th minute, I told myself I would open the envelope the moment I sat down at my own kitchen table alone, with enough quiet to give whatever was inside the attention it deserved. I had made it as far as my own driveway with that plan still intact. I was pulling into my own driveway when my phone rang. Dr. Okonkwo. Mr. Vance, she said, before I had even gotten the truck into park. I need you to come back to the hospital, now if you can. Is it Corinne? I said, my hand already back on the gear shift. No change in her condition, she said. This is something else. Something I found this morning, and I need you to see it before I decide what to do about it. I turned the truck around in my own driveway without cutting the engine. She was waiting for me outside her office when I arrived, and she did not say hello. She only opened the door and stepped back to let me through, then closed it behind us and turned the lock a small, deliberate click that told me more about how frightened she was than any sentence could have. At 8:17 this morning, she said someone attempted to modify your daughter's medical record. I sat down across from her desk without being asked. Our hospital uses an electronic system, she said. Every change made to a patient file is logged automatically. Timestamp user credentials and the network address of the machine that initiated the request. She turned her laptop screen toward me. 2 lines were highlighted in yellow. The request came in at 8:17 minutes before I got a call from our hospital administrator asking me to, and I am quoting him, directly review my documentation and make sure it reflects the most accurate clinical picture. I looked at the screen. Rows of text, most of it meaningless to me except for the 2 lines she had marked. What were they trying to change it to? I asked. Accidental trauma, she said. Consistent with a single fall. They wanted the 4-incident pattern removed from the chart entirely and replaced with language suggesting 1 accident, 1 night, nothing before it. She scrolled the log further down. And it wasn't a clumsy attempt, Mr. Vance. Whoever drafted the replacement language used the correct clinical terminology. Consistent with reported mechanism of injury. The exact phrase from your daughter's ER visit 8 months ago. The one that was never cross-referenced against the neighbor complaint filed around the same time. Someone either has access to that old file or someone was careful enough to make it sound like they did. I felt something settle into my chest, cold and very still. The particular calm that comes after fury has already burned through the part of you that reacts and left only the part that plans. Whose administrator called you? I said. Glenn Marsh, she said. Hospital administration. He didn't tell me directly to falsify anything. He was careful. He said he hoped I would, quote, ensure the documentation reflected the most accurate picture. I know exactly what that means. I have practiced medicine for 17 years, Mr. Vance. I have never had a complaint filed against my license. Not once. This morning I learned that an anonymous complaint had been filed with the Texas Medical Board an hour before Glenn Marsh called me. Alleged clinical negligence, improper documentation. Did you change anything? I asked. No, she said, flat and immediate. And I will not. Not for Marsh, not for the board complaint, not for anyone who calls after this conversation and asks me the same question a different way. She opened a drawer in her desk and set a manila folder on the surface between us. I want you to understand what I did before anyone had the chance to pressure me further, she said. This morning, before Marsh ever called, I submitted a complete confidential report to the medical board myself through their independent reporting system. My original findings. The full imaging analysis. A written timeline of every incident I documented. That report exists now in a system that Glenn Marsh cannot access, and nobody at this hospital can quietly amend. She reached into a cup on her desk and picked up a pen, uncapped it, and set it down again beside the folder, an old habit I would come to recognize later, the pen she used for anything that mattered, ink that could not be scratched out once it hit the page. I noticed she had used the same pen on every page in the folder, the same steady, unhurried hand, none of the shortcuts a busy physician might allow herself on a normal Tuesday. I chose this pen for the same reason I chose to file that report before breakfast, she said. Some things need to exist in a form nobody can erase. I learned that lesson young from a mentor who told me handwriting in permanent ink forces you to think before you write, because you cannot pretend later that you meant something different. Mr. Vance, she said, I need your permission to use everything in this folder, all of it in whatever comes next. You have it, I said. Every piece of it. I did not go to medical school, To let someone erase what was done to that woman, she said. Then she turned the laptop screen fully toward me and pointed to the address beside the highlighted entry. I leaned forward and read it twice to be certain I understood what I was looking at. "That's not a hospital address," I said. "No," she said. "It isn't." "Then whose is it?" I asked, though some part of me had already begun to understand the answer before I finished the question. The same cold certainty I used to feel in a courtroom in the half-second before a witness confirmed what the evidence had already told me. Dr. Okonkwo did not look away from me when she answered. "This is not a Sequatchie general address, Mr. Vance," she said. "This is the district attorney's office." Otis Prentice had spent 11 years as sheriff of this county before he retired, and he still moved like a man who expected trouble to announce itself before it arrived. He met me at his door with 2 mugs of coffee already poured, handed me one without asking the way men do when they've known each other long enough to skip the small negotiations, and led me back to his kitchen table. His garden was visible through the window behind him. Tomato stakes standing bare in the November light, and along the back fence, a strip of wildflowers he had let grow wild on purpose. The kind that keep bees working long after most gardens have gone quiet for the season. I noticed it and said nothing. There would be time for that conversation another day, if there was ever a day for it again. He sat down across from me, folded his hands, and waited. I laid out everything. The 4 documented incidents, Silas Wren's account of 3 buried reports, and Sergeant Dean Holloway closing each one. Pastor Tull's confession. Marisol Reyes's 4 pages of witness testimony. The modification attempt on Corinne's medical chart, and the address it had traced back to. I set the folder from Dr. Okonkwo on the table last on top of everything else. The way you set the final piece of evidence down in front of a jury, when you want them to understand that everything before it had been leading here. Otis listened the way he had always listened, completely still, his coffee going untouched, his eyes on mine the entire time. He did not interrupt once. When I finished, he picked up his mug, took a long, slow sip, and set it down with the particular deliberateness of a man who had already made a decision and was only confirming it to himself before he said it out loud. "Dean Holloway," he said. "I promoted that man to sergeant myself back in 2011. He was a good officer then." His jaw tightened. People change when they stop believing anybody's watching. "Can you go through the department?" I asked. "Somebody you still trust in there?" "No," he said. Flat and immediate, the same tone Dr. Okonkwo had used that morning. Not with Holloway running internal reviews. Not with Bram's connections inside that building. "Anything you send through the front door of the Sequatchie County Sheriff's Office is going to cross a desk that answers one way or another to people who have every reason to slow it down. You have to understand how a place like this works, Solomon," he said. "Small county, small department. Everybody's cousin, everybody's college roommate, everybody's youth league coach. Dean Holloway isn't corrupt the way you'd picture it in a movie. He's not taking envelopes of cash in a parking garage. He's just a man who has spent 9 years deciding that loyalty to a friend matters more than 3 separate women's paperwork. That kind of rot doesn't announce itself. It just quietly closes files and calls it discretion." He stood up and crossed to a drawer beside the counter. The kind of kitchen drawer that accumulates the things a person doesn't want to file away formally. He came back with a small spiral notepad and a pen, and sat down again unhurried, as though we had all the time in the world instead of none. "Special Agent Priscilla Ray," he said, writing the name out slowly. "Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, Chattanooga Field Office. She came up through the department under me 98 to 2004 before she transferred over to the state level." He tore the page free and slid it across the table. "The Bureau operates completely outside county authority. Separate chain of command, separate jurisdiction, separate everything. If Priscilla opens a case, Dean Holloway can't touch it, can't slow it down, can't make one phone call that changes a single thing about how it moves. He looked at me steadily over the rim of his mug. But Solomon, once I call her, the machine starts moving. It doesn't stop for anybody, and it doesn't stop because somebody's feelings get hurt along the way. You understand that. I looked down at the name written on the notepad in front of me. Then I looked at my own notebook still open on the table beside it. The word Bram still sitting at the top of the first page, 14 pages of documented fact, filling everything beneath it. I had spent most of my working life believing that patience was a virtue you earned through discipline, that a man who waited long enough, watched carefully enough, would eventually be handed the whole truth without ever having to reach for it himself. I had believed that the morning Dr. Okonkwo showed me a modification log with a district attorney's address on it. I had believed it standing in a hospital waiting room while my son-in-law checked his phone like nothing in the world was wrong. I did not believe it anymore. "Make the call, Otis," I said. He nodded. Once picked up his phone and dialed from memory, no need to check the notepad in front of him. Some numbers I supposed a man kept somewhere other than a kitchen drawer. He was on the line for 11 minutes. I sat with my coffee and looked out at his garden, at the last of the tomato stakes standing bare against the cold, at the wildflowers along the fence line, still holding a few late blossoms into a season that should have already finished them off. Otis had planted that strip for the bees years ago, back when we still ran into each other at every hardware store and diner in a 20-mile radius, back before either of us had much reason to think about county politics or district attorneys or files that close themselves without anyone ever asking why. I remembered him telling me once that a good garden takes care of things you can't see the value of yet. I had thought at the time that he only meant the bees. When he finally hung up, he set the phone down carefully, the way a man sets something down when he wants to be certain it stays exactly where he put it. "Priscilla will see you," he said. "Day after tomorrow, Chattanooga field office." He paused, and something in his face shifted the professional stillness, giving way just slightly to something closer to relief. She said, "Bring everything," he said. "All of it. Don't leave anything at home because you thought it might not matter." I closed my notebook and stood up, and for the first time in 2 days, the tightness that had been sitting in my chest since 2 o'clock that first morning loosened by some small, measurable degree. Not gone. Not close to gone. But different than it had been an hour ago, and I had learned enough over the last 2 days to know that different right now was worth counting. Dean Holloway showed up at Otis Prentice's front door less than 3 hours after I left, and he did not come to talk about the weather, though that was how he opened. I only know this because Otis called me himself. 40 minutes later, his voice pitched lower than I had ever heard it, the careful, low register of a man checking over his own shoulder in his own kitchen. Otis told it to me like this. He'd been out back checking the last of his tomato stakes when he heard a car in the driveway, unmarked dark sedan. No lights, no siren, nothing official about it except the man who got out of it. Dean Holloway. Out of uniform hands in his jacket pockets, wearing the particular smile of a man who has practiced looking relaxed. Sheriff Dean said, though Otis hadn't held that title in years, and Dean knew it. "Just driving through the neighborhood. Thought I'd stop and see how retirement's treating you." Otis said he stood at the edge of his own garden and did not invite the man any closer to the house. "Can't complain," Otis told him. "Tomatoes came in late this year." Dean nodded. Looked around the yard, the way a man looks around a room he's trying to memorize, his eyes moving slow across the tree line, the fence, the shed, the truck parked in the drive, like he was counting something and didn't want it to show. Then he said casual, almost an afterthought, "Heard you had a visitor earlier." "Solomon Vance," small county Otis said back to him, matching the same casual tone. Man can't have coffee with an old friend without it getting around by supper. Dean's smile didn't move, but something behind it did, Otis said. Just wanted to check in, Dean told him. Given everything going on with his family right now. Rough time for everybody. Wanted you to know if you hear from him, if he's asking questions, might be worth reminding him that going outside proper channels on something like this tends to complicate things. For everybody, including people he cares about. Otis said Dean mentioned Bram by name only once near the end, almost in passing. Said Kess is going through something right now, and it'd be a shame if it got made harder than it needs to be. Otis told me that was the moment he understood exactly how deep the loyalty ran, that even now, even with everything Silas Wren had described to me in a hospital hallway, Dean Holloway was still calling a man under investigation by his college nickname. Still talking about him the way you talk about a friend going through a rough patch instead of a man who had broken his wife's bones 4 separate times. Otis said he didn't answer that directly. Said he just told Dean he'd keep it in mind and watched him get back in his car and watched the car pull out of the driveway, slow, unhurried, the way a man drives when he wants you to know he isn't in any rush at all. That was the whole conversation, Otis told me over the phone. 2 minutes, maybe less. But he knew Solomon. Somehow he already knew you'd been to see me, and that means he knows you're building something. And if he knows that much this fast, I need you to understand what that means, about how careful we have to be from here on. I stood in my own front yard while he talked the phone against my ear, the November wind moving through the bare branches of the oak at the edge of my property. And for a long moment after he stopped talking, I did not say anything at all. I only listened. The wind. A dog barking somewhere down the road. A truck downshifting on the highway half a mile off the sound, carrying farther than it should have in the cold, flat air. The particular silence of a place that looks exactly the same as it did yesterday, and is not the same at all. The porch light came on behind me. Opal in the doorway, one hand still on the switch, watching me with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned to read the back of her husband's neck, as well as his face. "Everything all right?" she asked. I did not answer her right away. I stood there another moment with the phone still warm against my ear, though Otis had not spoken in several seconds, and I found that I did not have a sentence ready that could hold what had just happened, without also frightening her more than the moment required. "Come inside when you're ready," she said, and did not push further and went back in and left the porch light burning for me. "Did he threaten you?" I finally asked, turning back to the call. Not in words, a lawyer could do anything with Otis said. But I've known that man a long time, Solomon, back when he was a rookie, who still called me sir without being told to. What just happened in my driveway wasn't a friendly check-in. That was the message delivered careful enough that I couldn't repeat it to anybody and have it sound like what it actually was. "What do we do?" I said. "We move faster than they expect," Otis said. "Priscilla already has your appointment. I'm going to call her again tonight and tell her what just happened here. Because if Dean Holloway already knows enough to send somebody driving through my neighborhood within 3 hours of your visit that tells us his network runs wider and faster than either of us gave it credit for, it also tells us something else." "What's that?" I asked. "It tells us they're worried," he said. "Men who aren't worried don't send somebody to check on the neighbors. And there's one more thing you should hear before you hang up, Solomon, because I don't want you finding it out later and wondering why I didn't say it now. If Dean already knows you came to see me, there's a decent chance he'll assume I gave you my old contact at the bureau, which means the clock on this just got shorter than either of us planned for. Whatever you're going to gather it fast, and don't leave a single piece of it somewhere he could get to it before we do." I told him I understood. I am not certain, standing there in my own yard with the wind moving through the bare branches of the oak, that I fully did. Not yet. That understanding would come later in pieces, the way most hard truths arrive a little at a time until suddenly you are holding the whole weight of them at once and cannot remember which piece landed first. He was quiet for a moment on the line. "They know Solomon," he said. "I don't know how, but they know." I went inside after Otis hung up and found Emmett sitting at the kitchen table where Opal had left him a mug of hot chocolate gone lukewarm in front of him, a small spiral notebook held flat beneath both hands like something he was keeping from blowing away. "Grandpa," he said, "can I show you something?" I sat down across from him, the same chair I'd occupied for every homework session and every Sunday dinner for 12 years, and waited. "It's the one you gave me," he said, "for my birthday. The beekeeping one." I remembered it. A small notebook with a honeycomb pattern on the cover bought at the farm supply store the year he turned 10, meant for recording hive inspections, the way I had taught him temperature, activity level, whether the queen was still laying well. He had taken to it more seriously than I expected for a boy his age, filling pages with careful notes. Every time he came to help me with the hives, I started using it for something else, he said. About 8 months ago. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't really know why I was doing it at first. It just felt like somebody should know, and I couldn't tell anyone because Dad said he stopped his jaw working the way it does when he's forcing himself through something hard. Dad said if I ever told anyone what happened at home, the government would come and split us up. Put me in a group home. I believed that for a long time, but I kept writing it down anyway, because I thought maybe someday there'd be somebody I could show it to. He opened the notebook to the first page he'd used for this, and I understood immediately why it had taken him 8 months to trust anyone with it. There were no words. Only symbols, small and careful, drawn in the margins beside dates. A circle with a line through it. A triangle sometimes shaded, sometimes not. A shape that might have been a closed door repeated in various sizes. I made up my own marks, he said. Like a code. A closed hive means Dad was in a bad mood, but nothing happened. A hive with smoke around it means there was yelling. He turned a page, his finger hovering over a different symbol. This one, the triangle, that's for when Mom got hurt. When it's shaded in all the way, that means it was bad enough she couldn't hide it good the next day. There's this other one too, he said, pointing to a small square drawn in the corner of several pages. That means I stayed in my room with the door closed like Mom told me to. And this one, he said, tapping a tiny mark that looked almost like a check. That's for the days I checked on her after when it seemed safe enough. You did help, I told him. You have been helping her for 8 months in ways I am only now starting to understand. I looked at page after page. March, April, May. The shaded triangles were rare in the early months, appearing, perhaps, once every 3 or 4 weeks. By August, they were closer together. By October, the month before the phone call that had brought us all to the hospital, I counted 4 in a single 2-week span, the intervals between them shrinking the way a fuse shortens as it burns down toward whatever it was built to reach. How did you know to keep track like this? I asked him, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. He shrugged, a boy's gesture too casual for what it was covering. I don't know. I guess you always told me when you're checking a hive, write down everything, even the stuff that doesn't seem important yet, because you don't know what's going to matter until later. So I just did that. With this instead of bees, I held that notebook very tightly in both hands for a moment, tighter than the pages required, and said nothing at all because there was nothing I could have said that would not have sounded to a 12-year-old boy who had just handed his grandfather 8 months of a secret he'd carried alone. Like it was somehow his fault that no adult in his life had noticed what he'd been forced to notice on his own. There's one more page, he said, quieter now. His hand hovered over the notebook without turning it. I don't really want to show you this one. but I think you need to see it." He turned to the final entry, dated 3 days before the night Corinne had been found on her kitchen floor. It was not one symbol. It was 7 drawn close together, overlapping in places darker than anything on the pages before it, as though he had gone over the pencil marks again and again without meaning, to the way a hand keeps moving after the mind has already said enough. "I want there to be a record somewhere safer than here," he said, reading from memory rather than the page, though the words matched something I would find days later in an entirely different notebook in an entirely different hand. I don't know why I wrote that part in actual words instead of symbols. I just felt like somebody needed to be able to read it plain if it ever came to that. The kitchen clock ticked on the wall above the stove, and somewhere down the hall, the lamp in Opal's sewing room threw a narrow line of light across the hardwood, and neither of us said anything for a long moment. I did not comment on what I was feeling. I only sat there with my grandson's notebook open between us, listening to a clock mark seconds that felt for once entirely too loud. "Emmett," I finally said, "you and your mother did the exact same thing without either of you knowing the other one was doing it. She kept a written record. You kept this. 2 different languages saying the same thing." He looked up at me, something in his face, asking a question he didn't have words for yet. "Neither one of you was ever going to let this disappear," I told him. "Whatever else happens now, I need you to understand that." He was quiet for a moment, turning the notebook slowly in his hands. The honeycomb pattern on the cover worn soft at the corners from 8 months spent, tucked under a mattress or inside a backpack, wherever a 12-year-old boy learns to hide the things he cannot afford to have found. "Are you going to show it to somebody?" he asked. "The police, I mean. Or whoever's supposed to see this kind of thing." "Yes," I said. "If that's all right with you." He nodded, slow, like a boy signing off on something far larger than his years should have required of him. "Will it help Mom?" he asked. "That's the only thing I want to know. Not whether Dad gets in trouble. Just whether it helps her." "It will," I said. He pushed the notebook the rest of the way across the table toward me, both hands flat against the cover for one final second before he let it go entirely, the way you let go of something you have been carrying alone for so long that your hands have nearly forgotten what it feels like to be empty. Opal had set it on the kitchen counter 3 days earlier, the afternoon the hospital released Corinne's personal effects into our keeping, and neither of us had touched it since. A small ledger book, the kind you can buy at any office supply store, black cover gone soft at the corners. The word accounts embossed in fading gold across the front. It had come home in a clear plastic bag along with her wallet, her house keys, and a hair tie, and Opal had lifted it out, looked at it for a long moment, turned it over once in her hands, as though weighing it, and set it on the counter without a word, and we had both walked past it a dozen times since, without either of us reaching for it. I think we each believed, without saying so, that opening it belonged to the other one, and that whichever of us finally did would be the one who had to carry whatever was inside it first. I reached for it that night. After Emmett had gone up to bed, and Opal had gone up not long after him, and the house had settled into the particular quiet that comes after midnight in a home that is holding more people than usual and less certainty than it has ever held before. Corinne had kept books for the county agricultural cooperative for 9 years before she cut back her hours, and her handwriting inside that ledger was nothing like the handwriting I remembered from her childhood. The round, generous cursive she had used on birthday cards and school assignments, looping and unhurried, the kind of handwriting a girl practices in the margins of her notebooks until it becomes as much a part of her as her own voice. This was tight, compressed, efficient, the hand of a woman who had spent nearly a decade recording numbers accurately enough that another person's business depended on them, every letter pressed close to the next, as if she had trained herself 1 page at a time to take up as little space as possible. I opened to the first page and understood within a few lines that I was not looking at a household budget. The entries were dated each one, and each one carried a dollar figure and a short description, the kind of thing that would look entirely unremarkable to anyone who wasn't looking for something else. Hardware $12, groceries $46, gas $31. But the dollar figures did not add correctly against the totals at the bottom of each page, off by small amounts. $3 here, $7 there. Never enough to draw attention, unless you were the kind of man who had spent 30 years learning to notice when numbers didn't sit right. I went back to the first page and started reading the descriptions instead of the totals, and that was when I understood what I was actually holding. Hardware $12. Read straight through it meant nothing. But the 12 I realized slowly the way you realize a word in another language once you've heard it enough times, corresponded. And besides certain entries in the smallest handwriting, I had ever seen my daughter produce notes that looked at first like abbreviations for store names. LR, one said, left ribs. FA, said another, forearm. I checked each abbreviation against the dates in Emmett's beekeeping notebook, laid open beside the ledger on the table, and the two records lined up with a precision that made something cold settle low in my chest. The shaded triangle he had drawn on the 9th of August matched almost to the day an entry in this ledger marked LR $40, the number itself meaningless, chosen only to fill the space a real grocery expense might have occupied. Two children, in a manner of speaking, one 12 years old and one 34, keeping the same record in two languages neither of them knew the other was writing. I sat at my own kitchen table at 1 in the morning and worked backward through 9 months of what looked to anyone who did not know to look closer like an ordinary woman's household ledger, and was in fact a second record entirely running parallel to the one Emmett had kept in a beekeeping notebook, parallel to whatever Marisol Reyes was still holding in her kitchen drawer, parallel to the 23 pages I did not yet know existed, but would within the week hold in my own hands. 3 separate people, 3 separate languages, all of them documenting the same 8 months, none of them aware the others were doing it. Near the middle of the ledger, one entry had been circled faintly in pencil, the graphite gone soft and smudged, as though the circle had been drawn and reconsidered and drawn again, pressed down harder, the second time like a hand that had almost erased something and then decided against it. Transfer $300, the entry read. No further description. No initials matching an injury, nothing that fit the pattern of every other line above and below it. Just the circle. And beneath it, in handwriting pressed harder into the page than anything around it, a single word I could not yet make sense of. Started. I sat looking at that word for a long time. Started what I did not know. There was no month attached to it, no explanation, nothing to connect it forward or backward to any other entry in the book. It sat alone on the page the way a single unanswered question sits in the middle of an otherwise finished thought, and I found myself circling it a second time in my own mind, the way you circle a fact in a case file that doesn't fit yet, but that you know somehow you will need later. I did not know that night what it meant. I would understand it later, and by the time I did, it would matter more than almost anything else in that entire ledger. I turned to the final page, the one Corinne had used most recently, dated only 9 days before the phone call that had ended with all of us standing in a hospital hallway. Most of the page was the same as the others, careful numbers, careful abbreviations. The quiet architecture of a woman building a case. One entry at a time without ever writing a single word that would look to anyone flipping through it casually, like anything other than groceries and gas and the ordinary math of running a household. But at the very bottom of that final page, beneath the last entry in handwriting, smaller and more deliberate than anything above it, as though she had written it and then sat looking at it for a long time before closing the book, was a single line that had nothing to do with money at all. Not a dollar figure, not an abbreviation, a name. Hamilton County. I left Dunlap before the sun was fully up the truck cab, cold enough that I could see my own breath for the first 2 miles. The radio off, the only sound, the tires against blacktop, and the occasional groan of the heater working its way toward warm. 45 minutes to Chattanooga on a clear morning, and I used every one of them not to think. I had done enough thinking at my own kitchen table the night before. I used them to go over the sequence in my head, the way I used to review a case file before a hearing. What order to lay it out in, what I needed a stranger behind a desk to understand without my having to explain twice why any of it mattered. Somewhere around the Sequatchie County line, my mind went back uninvited to a case I had not thought about in almost 15 years. A family out past Pikeville, the Holts had hired me to testify in a boundary dispute over 11 acres their neighbor had begun fencing as his own. I had walked that property for 2 full seasons before I ever set foot in a courtroom, tracking where 3 generations of my hives foraged, because bees do not adjust their flight patterns for a new stake in the ground, only for where the good forage actually is, and where the good forage was told a truer story than any deed the county had on file. The Holts had wanted to move quickly. Their neighbor was already grading a section of the disputed land, already talking to a contractor about a pole barn. I told them to wait. I told them the case would be stronger with a full season of data behind it, instead of half a season of guesswork. That patience built a record no lawyer could pick apart, that rushing to court with an incomplete picture was how good cases got lost. They waited because I told them to, and because in an agricultural county an old beekeeper's word carried more weight than it probably should have. By the time we finally had our day in court, the neighbor's pole barn was framed and roofed, half built on the disputed acreage, and the judge weighing the practical cost of tearing down a structure against the Holt's claim, split the property in a way that gave the family considerably less than the full 11 acres my season of data had clearly supported. The barn had become, in the judge's own words, a fact on the ground that the law was reluctant to disturb. I had been right about the evidence. I had been wrong about the waiting. I had never told anyone, not even Opal, how many nights I had lain awake afterward, wondering whether the Holts would have kept their whole 11 acres if I had simply told them to file the moment the fence went up, crooked evidence or no evidence, and let the case get stronger as it went, rather than waiting for it to be perfect before we ever walked through a courthouse door. Mrs. Holt had sent me a Christmas card every year for almost a decade afterward, polite, warm, never once mentioning the barn or the acreage they'd lost, and I had always told myself that her silence on the subject meant she had made her peace with it. It occurred to me, driving toward Chattanooga with the heater finally blowing warm across my knees, that I had never actually asked her whether that was true, and that a woman's silence on a subject, and her peace with it, were not in fact the same thing at all. I had built an entire philosophy of patience on top of an assumption I had never once tested. I had not thought about the Holts in 15 years. I thought about them the entire drive to Chattanooga. The Hamilton County Courthouse sat downtown, a broad limestone building with tall windows and a set of concrete steps worn smooth in the middle by decades of foot traffic. Nothing like the low brick municipal building back home where I knew the clerks by their first names and could park directly outside the door I needed without ever having to ask which entrance to use. Here I circled the block twice before I found a parking garage fed a ticket machine I didn't fully understand, and walked 3 blocks in the cold, with my collar up, feeling for the first time in 2 days entirely like a stranger in a place that had no idea who I was or why I had come. Inside, the lobby smelled like floor wax and old paper, the particular smell of a building where records had been kept carefully or carelessly for well over a century. A directory board listed the circuit court clerk's office on the second floor, vital records, and general filings, and beneath that, in smaller print, a public records room where a person could search filings by name. I climbed the stairs rather than wait for the elevator, my legs already restless from 45 minutes in a truck cab, and found the records room at the end of a long hallway, lined with portraits of judges I did not recognize, men in black robes who had presided over a county I had no history. In a county Corinne had chosen for reasons I still did not understand 3 months before a phone call had brought all of us to a hospital in the middle of the night. I gave the clerk my daughter's full name and her married name and asked whether anything had been filed under either one in the last 12 months. The clerk, a young man with a lanyard full of keys, and the patient practiced boredom of someone who processed 100 such requests a week, typed the names into a terminal, frowned slightly at whatever appeared on the screen, and looked back up at me with an expression I could not immediately read. "I'll need you to fill out this request form," he said, sliding a clipboard across the counter. "And I'll need to see identification confirming your relationship to the filer." Why I asked, though, something in my chest had already begun to understand the answer before I finished asking the question. "Because this particular filing has a confidentiality flag on it," he said. "Court order. I can release it to you, but only after I verify who you are." I filled out the form with a hand that was steadier than I expected and handed him my license and waited while he disappeared through a door behind the counter into a records room I could not see into and stood there in a hallway full of strangers' portraits. 35 years of teaching myself patience, finally running out at almost exactly the same moment I would need every last piece of it I had left. The clerk came back through the door behind the counter carrying a slim folder thinner than I had expected, thin enough that for one unsteady moment I wondered whether he had brought me the wrong file entirely. "I'll need you to sign for it," he said, sliding a log sheet across the counter along with the folder. "It stays in this room. You're welcome to read it here as long as you need, and I can make copies at the machine by the window if you want to take pages with you, 15 cents each." I signed where he pointed, my hand steadier than my chest felt, and carried the folder to a small table near the window where the November light came through tall glass in a long, pale rectangle across the wood. I opened it and found on top a civil filing dated 3 months earlier. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Corinne Kessler versus Bram Kessler. Filed in Hamilton County, not Sequatchie. A detail the form itself explained in a short line near the top. A statement that the petitioner had established residency requirements sufficient to file in this jurisdiction, along with a citation to a Tennessee statute permitting exactly that under certain circumstances. I read the line twice before I understood what it meant. She had not stumbled into filing in the wrong county by accident or out of confusion or because a lawyer somewhere had made a clerical error. She had built her residency here on purpose, weeks or months ahead of the filing itself, specifically so that this document would exist in a courthouse. Bram's name meant nothing in under a judge who had never shaken his hand at a county function, inside a system his position as assistant district attorney back home could not touch, could not slow, could not quietly redirect to a friendlier desk. I turned to the second page, and the second page was where I stopped being able to read quickly. Grounds for divorce, it said, and beneath that heading in the flat, careful language of a legal document, rather than the compressed shorthand of a kitchen ledger, was an account of what had happened inside that house. Dates, specific incidents, injuries described in language a lawyer had helped her choose, precise and unemotional and devastating for exactly that reason, because there was no exaggeration left for anyone to argue against, only a list incident by incident, each one dated. each one cross-referenced to a page number in an attached exhibit I had not yet found. I found the exhibit 3 pages later. Photographs. A medical summary from a clinic in a town I did not recognize. An hour outside Chattanooga dated months before Dr. Okonkwo had ever treated her evidence of an earlier visit Corinne had made entirely on her own, entirely outside our county, entirely outside anywhere Bram or Dean Holloway or anyone connected to either of them would ever have thought to look. At the bottom of the final page was her signature. I had watched my daughter sign her name 1,000 times over 34 years on school permission slips, on a wedding registry, on the bottom of Christmas cards. This signature was not shaky. It was not the signature of a woman writing under duress, rushed, or frightened, or barely holding a pen, steady enough to finish her own name. It was deliberate, evenly spaced, the same signature she had used her whole adult life. The signature of someone who had sat down at a desk, read every word of what she was signing and signed it anyway, because she had already decided long before that morning exactly what she needed this document to do. I sat with that folder open in front of me for a long time. Somewhere in the building behind me, a door closed. Footsteps crossed a hallway, ordinary sounds of an ordinary courthouse morning, continuing without any awareness of what I was holding at a small table by a window. I found myself thinking of the day Corinne had asked to sit in on one of my expert testimony sessions when she was 16, watching from the back row as I explained forage patterns to a jury who had never once thought about where a bee traveled and why it mattered. She had asked me afterward how I knew when I had enough evidence to be certain. I told her you never really knew. You gathered until the picture became undeniable, and then you moved, and moving too early was how a case fell apart under pressure. I had believed that completely. What I had never told her, because I had never fully understood it myself until this exact morning, was that a person could gather everything necessary and still choose the wrong moment to act, simply by waiting one day longer than the situation could afford. I had believed, without ever quite saying it to myself, that Corinne was a woman waiting to be rescued, a woman who had frozen inside a marriage. She could not find her way clear of a woman whose silence for 14 months meant she had not yet found the strength to act. I had built an entire understanding of the last 2 days around that belief, had told myself I was moving carefully, methodically, gathering the evidence a case like this would require before I let anyone move too fast and risk losing ground the way the Holts had lost ground 15 years earlier. She had already filed 3 months ago, in a county specifically chosen so that no one in her own life could interfere with it. While I was still deciding whether it was too soon to knock on Marisol Reyes's door, I closed the folder and sat in the truck in the parking garage for a long while before I turned the key, my hands resting flat on the steering wheel, the engine off the cold, settling into the cab around me, while I tried to make room in my chest for what I had just learned. I had spent 35 years telling students, and later telling my own daughter, that patience was a form of discipline, that the truth rewarded the person willing to wait for it properly, instead of grabbing at it too soon. I had believed that so completely that I had spent 2 full days documenting, interviewing, building a case with the careful, unhurried thoroughness of a man convinced that waiting was itself a kind of strength. Corinne had not waited. She had built her own case in her own county in her own time, months before any of this reached a hospital hallway, and she had done it without telling a single person in her own family, because she understood something about patience that I, for all my 35 years of practicing it, had never once had to learn. Patience was not the same thing as standing still. I had taught my daughter to document the truth and wait for the right moment to use it. What I had never taught her, because I had never learned it myself, was that the right moment sometimes required you to move before anyone told you it had arrived. I started the engine and pulled out of the garage into the gray Chattanooga morning, and for the first time since the phone had rung 2 nights earlier, I understood that the person I had been chasing to catch up with the entire time was not Bram Kessler. It was my own daughter. Bram was standing outside Corinne's room when I came off the elevator, not sitting in the family waiting area where he had spent most of the last 2 days, but standing directly outside her door, one hand resting flat against the frame, the posture of a man who wanted to look like he belonged there and had not quite convinced himself of it either. He straightened when he saw me coming down the hall. "Solomon," he said, "I was hoping you'd get here. I wanted to talk to you before before Opal gets here, man to man." I stopped a few feet from him and did not offer my hand. "I have something I need to ask you," I said. "And I need you to actually answer it instead of whatever you were about to say instead." He nodded too quickly, the nod of a man agreeing to terms he hadn't fully heard yet, because agreeing felt safer than the alternative. "Of course," he said, "anything." Something shifted behind his eyes, quick, recalibrating the same look I had watched him wear in a hospital waiting room 2 nights earlier when his first performance hadn't landed the way he wanted it to. "Okay," he said, "ask me." "When did you find out Corinne filed for divorce in Hamilton County?" I said. I watched it hit him. Not the way a slap hits sudden and visible. The way cold water hits when you're already standing in it, and only now notice how deep you've gotten. His jaw moved once, and no words came out of it for a long moment. "I don't know what you're talking about," he finally said, and even he seemed to hear how thin it sounded because he didn't try to hold the sentence up a second time. "I have a copy of the petition," I said. "I have the grounds she listed. I have the exhibit with a medical summary from a clinic an hour outside this county that predates every visit you know about. She built a case against you 3 months ago, Bram, in a jurisdiction specifically chosen so you couldn't reach it, and she did it without telling a single person in this family because she understood something about you that the rest of us were still catching up to." He reached into his jacket pocket, an old habit, the kind of small, unconscious motion a man makes when his hands need somewhere to go, and his fingers closed around the pen, clipped there, the same pen he'd carried since the day he was sworn in as an assistant district attorney. A gift from a mentor who had believed in him back when believing in him was still an easy thing to do. I watched his knuckles go pale around it. "You don't understand what it's been like," he said. His voice had dropped lower, rougher, less rehearsed than anything I'd heard from him yet. "The department passed me over for assistant chief. Then Holloway got the promotion I should have gotten. Everything I built, everything I thought I was owed for putting in the work, it just kept going to somebody else. And I came home every night feeling like less of a man than I'd been that morning, and I didn't know what to do with that." "That is not an answer to my question," I said. He looked at me, and for just a moment, the performance dropped away entirely, and what was underneath it was something raw and cornered. A man who had run out of the room he needed to keep telling the story the way he wanted it told. "There's a possibility?" he said, his voice unsteady now, actually unsteady. For the first time since I'd met him at that emergency entrance 2 nights ago. "There's a possibility I've been up for the district attorney nomination. Full county DA, not assistant. It's been in motion for months, quiet, the kind of thing that isn't announced until it's already decided. Marsh knows. A couple of people on the county commission know. If any of this comes out the way it actually happened, that's finished. Everything I've spent my whole career building, finished over one bad stretch that got out of hand." 4 incidents is not a bad stretch," I said. "It is a pattern." Dr. Okonkwo used that word. I am going to use it too every time until it is the only word anyone in this county remembers about what happened in your house." His hand was shaking now, visibly, the pen still clenched in his fist inside his jacket pocket, and something in his face had begun to come apart in a way I had not seen from him yet. Not performance, not recalibration. something closer to a structure finally giving way under weight it had never been built to hold. "I loved her," he said. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know that's not what you want to hear right now. But I did. I do. None of this was supposed to go the way it went." "I know you did," I said, and I meant it, because I had found the poem in a drawer in their kitchen years earlier, clumsy and sincere, written in his own hand, the first year of their marriage, and I had never once doubted that the man who wrote it had existed. I know something happened to that man somewhere along the way, and I am sorry for whatever that was. But sorry does not undo 4 documented incidents. It does not undo a divorce petition your wife had to file in secret, because she was afraid of what you'd do if you found out in time to stop her. And it does not undo whatever else I am about to find, because I promise you, Bram, I am not finished looking." He did not answer that. He stood there with his hand still buried in his jacket pocket, his whole body trembling now. In a way, he was no longer bothering to hide his eyes, moving once toward the closed door behind him, toward the room where his wife lay, recovering from injuries he had caused, as though some part of him wanted to go back inside, and some other part understood he had no right to. "Solomon," he said, quieter now, almost pleading. "What happens now?" "I don't decide that anymore," I said. "That decision belongs to people who don't owe you 9 years of Sunday dinners. It belongs to Agent Ray. It belongs to whatever a jury eventually does with everything I hand them. And most of all, Bram, it belongs to my daughter when she wakes up and tells her own version of this in her own words to whoever is willing to listen." He looked past me down the hallway toward the elevator, toward the exit. The particular look of a man calculating whether there was still anywhere left to run to, and finding, apparently, that there wasn't. For the first time since I had known him 9 years of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings, I watched Bram Kessler run entirely out of anything left to say. I turned to go because there was nothing left to say to him that would change anything. And it was Bram's voice behind me, cracked and unsteady, that stopped me before I reached the elevator. "Wait," he said. "Solomon, wait." I stopped, but I did not turn around right away. I let him stand there a moment longer, let the silence do the work it needed to do, the way I used to let a witness sit with an uncomfortable question before I asked it a second time. "I didn't know about the filing until 3 weeks ago," he said. I turned back around. "You just told me you didn't know what I was talking about," I said. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, whatever was left of the performance had finally completely given out. "I found the confirmation email," he said, "on the shared cloud account. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking for something else, and it was just there. A receipt from the Hamilton County Clerk's office, and I understood what it meant the second I saw it." 3 weeks, I said. "And you didn't tell anyone." "Who was I going to tell?" he said. "You, Marsh, Holloway. Tell them my wife filed for divorce in secret in another county, building a case against me that I couldn't even see the full shape of. That's not a conversation a man goes looking to have with anyone." I watched something in his face shift again, and this time I recognized it, because I had seen it before on witnesses who had decided mid-sentence that they had already said too much to stop now. "What did you do?" I said. "When you found that email?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes went to the floor, to the pen still gripped in his fist, to anywhere that wasn't my face. "Bram," I said, "what did you do?" "I moved some of the accounts," he said so quietly I almost had to lean toward him to catch it. The joint checking. Part of the savings we'd built up over the marriage. I moved it into an account under my name only. I told myself it was just being careful in case things got complicated with the filing, in case a court eventually split everything down the middle and I needed something set aside. That's all it was. "That is not all it was," I said, and I heard my own voice go flat and cold in a way it hadn't gone even in the worst of the last 2 days. "That is a man protecting assets from a divorce he already knew was coming, while his wife was lying in a hospital bed 4 doors down this hallway. His face had gone the color of old paper. I didn't mean he started and then stopped, because there was no end to that sentence that wouldn't have made things worse. How much, I said. He didn't answer immediately, and I asked it again quieter this time, in the voice I used to use with a student who had already admitted to half a thing and needed only one more push to admit the rest. How much did you move, Bram? Most of it, he said. Almost $16,000. I did it over 3 separate transfers spread out so it wouldn't look like one large withdrawal on the statement. I told myself that was just being smart, not hiding anything. Just being smart. A man who spreads a withdrawal out over 3 transfers to avoid it. Looking like one large withdrawal is not being smart, I said. He is being careful about getting caught. Those are not the same thing, and you know that better than most people in this county, given what you do for a living. He flinched at that. A real flinch, the kind Emmett had shown me 2 nights earlier when I first put a hand on his shoulder, and for one strange moment I saw something almost pitiable in him. A man who had spent his whole career prosecuting other people's small deceptions and had somehow convinced himself his own would look different from the inside. I stood very still in that hallway. The fluorescent lights humming overhead, the way they had hummed for 2 straight days now. And I understood in the space of about 4 seconds exactly how much this changed. It was no longer only a question of documenting a pattern of abuse and letting the evidence speak in its own time. A man who moved money the moment he learned a case was building against him was a man who might move anything else the moment he sensed the walls closing further records, devices, whatever remained in that house that could still be touched, before anyone with real authority arrived to secure it. 3 weeks was a long time. 3 weeks was long enough to do considerably more than rearrange a bank account, and I had no way of knowing, standing in that hallway, what else he might already have quietly set in motion. I did not tell him what I was thinking. I did not give him the satisfaction of watching me react at all. 35 years of courtrooms and classrooms had taught me that a man in his position reads your reaction, as information uses it to calculate how much more he might still get away with saying, and I was not going to hand him one more piece of information he could use. I only reached into my own jacket pocket, past the notebook, past the sealed envelope I still had not opened, and took out my phone. "I need to make a call," I said, and walked past him toward the window at the end of the hallway without waiting to hear whatever he might have said to that. Behind me, I heard him sit down hard in one of the plastic waiting room chairs, the particular sound of a man whose legs had finally stopped agreeing to hold him up on their own. I dialed the number written on the notepad page Otis had torn free and handed me 2 days earlier the number I had already saved, the number I had hoped I would not need to use again. Quite this soon, not before the meeting we already had scheduled, not with news that could not wait even the few remaining hours until morning. "Special Agent Ray," a voice answered on the second ring, brisk alert, the voice of someone who did not treat any call as routine. "This is Solomon Vance," I said. "We're scheduled to meet tomorrow morning, but something's changed, and I don't think it can wait that long." "Tell me," she said. Agent Ray listened to everything I told her without a single interruption, and when I finished, she said only, "We can move on the accounts first thing tomorrow, before the branch even opens if we need to." And then she asked me to stay near a phone for the rest of the evening in case anything else surfaced before morning. I told her I would. I did not tell her that staying near a phone for me generally meant sitting at my own kitchen table with a pencil in my hand, because some habits explain themselves better than they can be described. I drove home as the light was failing that particular gray hour in late November, when the sun gives up on the day well before the clock says it should, and I was walking from the truck toward the house, when I heard a car slow on the road out front, then turn into my own driveway. Bram's car. Not the department sedan, his personal vehicle dark and unmarked, and Bram himself getting out of it. Slowly, his breath showing in the cold evening air, a man who had clearly spent a long stretch of time somewhere deciding whether to make this drive at all, and had arrived without ever fully settling the question. I did not walk toward the house. I walked toward the bee-yard instead, and after a moment, uninvited, he followed. The hives sat in a row along the back fence, quiet now. The last stragglers of the day's foraging drifting home in the fading light, small dark shapes disappearing one at a time into the narrow entrances at the base of each box. Bees do not fly at night. Whatever hadn't made it back by full dark would not survive until morning, and every evening of my adult life, I had felt some small private satisfaction in watching the last of them come in before the cold set fully in behind them. Solomon Bram said, stopping a respectful distance away, "I need to say some things, and I don't expect you to forgive any of it. I just need to say it." "Say it then," I told him, not turning from the hives. "I've been up for the district attorney nomination for 4 months," he said. "It would have been announced in January. I've wanted it since law school. Longer than that, honestly. My whole life I wanted to be the kind of man people respected the second his name came up in a room. And for a while, being on the force, working my way towards something bigger, it felt like I was actually becoming that man. Then Holloway got the promotion," I said. "And something in you decided the rest of us owed you a way to feel like that man again." He flinched, but he didn't argue the point. "I don't have an excuse," he said. "I know that. I've spent my whole career telling juries that pressure and bad luck don't excuse what a person does with their own hands. I can't stand here and tell you something different applies to me." "Then don't," I said. We stood there a moment in the cold, the last of the light draining out of the sky behind the ridgeline, one final bee, finding its way into the third hive. From the end, the small sound of it disappearing into the dark opening, the only movement left in the whole yard. "I loved her," he finally said. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it's not what you came out here to hear. But I did. I still do, whatever that's worth now. None of this was supposed to go the way it went." I turned to look at him fully for the first time since we'd walked out here. "I know you did," I said. "I found the poem you wrote her that first year folded up in a kitchen drawer years ago, long before any of this. I never told either of you I'd seen it. I know there was a man inside you who meant every word of it. I know something happened to that man somewhere between then and now. And I am sorry for whatever that was, genuinely sorry, because I don't think you set out the day you married my daughter to become the man standing in my bee-yard tonight." Something in his face loosened just slightly, the first real hope I'd seen cross it since the hospital hallway. "But I need you to hear the rest of this clearly," I said, and I let my voice go flat. And even the way I used to deliver a verdict I already knew a room didn't want to hear. Loving her once does not undo 4 documented incidents. It does not undo a divorce she had to file in secret, because she was afraid of what you'd do if you found out too soon. It does not undo $16,000 moved the moment you learned she was building a case against you. I believe you loved her, Bram. I do not doubt that for 1 second. But that love does not erase a single thing that happened in that house, and I need you to go home tonight. Understanding that nothing you say to me out here is going to change what happens next." He stood very still for a long moment, his breath fogging in the cold, his eyes moving once toward the hives, toward me, toward the dark shape of my own house beyond the fence line, as though he were trying to memorize all of it, or perhaps trying to understand how he had ended up standing in this particular yard, on this particular evening, uninvited, with nothing left to offer, that could change a single outcome ahead of him. "Is there anything I could do?" He said, his voice smaller now than I had ever heard it. "Anything at all?" that would actually help her. Not help me. Help her. Tell the truth when they ask you to, I said. All of it the first time without making anyone drag it out of you, piece by piece, the way you've made me do for the last 3 days. That is the only thing left that would count for anything, and even that will not undo what's already been done. It would simply mean you did one honest thing on your way out the door. He nodded slowly, and something in the movement told me he understood finally that there was no version of this conversation that ended with anything resembling forgiveness, and that he had not, in the end, come here for absolution so much as to hear out loud from someone who had once called him family exactly how far he had fallen. "I'm sorry, Solomon," he said, "for whatever that's worth to you now." I didn't answer him. I turned back toward the hives, toward the last quiet minutes of daylight settling over the yard, and after a while I heard his car door open, then close, and the engine start, and the tires move slow across the gravel of my driveway and out onto the road, the sound of it fading, the way sound fades on a still evening gradually, and then all at once until there was nothing left but the wind moving through the bare branches at the edge of the property, and the last of the bees, all of them home, now settled into the dark for the night. I stood in the bee yard for a long time after the sound of Bram's engine had finished fading into the distance, long after there was any reason left to stand there, until the cold had worked its way through my jacket and into the joints of my hands, and only then did I turn and walk into the shed instead of the house. I do not fully know why I went to the shed that night, instead of inside to Opal, to the kitchen, to whatever ordinary comfort a house can offer a man at the end of a day like that one. I have thought about it since more than once, and the closest answer I have arrived at is that some part of me was not yet ready to be looked at. Opal reads my face the way I read a jury, and I was not prepared standing in that cold yard for anyone to see clearly what was actually happening inside me. I turned on the single bulb that hangs above my workbench and sat down on the stool I had occupied every working evening of my life for longer than I could easily count. And for a while I did not do anything at all. I only sat. The old brood frame was still where I had left it days earlier, set on the shelf above the bench beside a coffee can of loose nails and a pair of pruning shears that needed sharpening, cracked along the same edge. It had been cracked along for 40 years, the edge I had never once repaired. I reached up and took it down the way I had that first morning, and set it in my lap, and ran my thumb along the old crack, the way I had done 1,000 times, without ever quite deciding to fix it. My hands were shaking. I noticed it the way you notice a sound that has been present for some time, before you become aware you are hearing it. I looked down at my own hands resting on the wooden frame in my lap, and watched them tremble a fine, steady shake that had nothing to do with the cold. Because the shed was not that cold, and everything to do with the 2.5 days I had spent holding myself together in hospital hallways and kitchen tables and courthouse records rooms without once allowing a single crack to show. I tried to pick up the pruning shears from the workbench, some old instinct toward useful motion, some need to have my hands doing a task, instead of simply shaking in my lap, and I could not close my fingers around the handles firmly enough to lift them. I set them back down. I tried a second time. My hand would not cooperate. I do not know how long I sat there like that, the frame in my lap, my hands refusing to do the one small, ordinary thing I had asked of them, the bulb overhead, humming faintly, the way old fixtures do the cold, pressing in at the edges of the shed, where the insulation had never been quite good enough. Long enough that the ache in my shoulders told me something about the passage of time that I had not been tracking any other way. Long enough that I heard somewhere off toward the county road a single truck pass and fade and then nothing, the particular deep quiet of a rural night with no moon yet risen. I thought of the 400 students I had stood in front of over 35 years, telling them year after year that history remembers those who document the truth, that the discipline of writing a thing down steadies a person even when nothing else can. I had believed that as completely as I had ever believed anything. I still believed it. But I understood sitting in that shed with my own hands betraying me, that I had never once told those students what happens after the documenting is done, after the case is built, and the truth is finally laid out where it can be seen. I had never told them that the body collects a bill for all that steadiness, and eventually, quietly, without asking permission, it comes due. I thought of Corinne's signature on that petition, steady and unhurried, a woman who had held herself together long enough to build an entire case in secret, while living inside the thing the case was built to escape. I thought of Emmett's pencil marks pressed so hard into the last page of his notebook that they had nearly torn through it. I thought of Marisol's careful handwriting filling 4 pages at my own kitchen table and Dr. Okonkwo's pen that could not be scratched out once it touched paper, and Otis dialing a number from memory because some numbers a man keeps somewhere other than a drawer. Everyone around me for 2.5 days had found some way to hold their hands steady enough to do what needed doing. Mine had finally stopped. I do not think it was weakness, though. I sat with that possibility for a while, turning it over the way I turn over a fact that doesn't yet fit the case I am building. I think it was closer to the particular exhaustion that comes after you have spent every available hour convincing other people and yourself that you can carry a thing steadily, and the carrying finally reaches a point where the body simply stops agreeing to the performance, whether or not the mind has finished needing it. I set the frame down on the workbench carefully, both hands cradling it, the way you cradle something you are afraid of dropping, precisely because your hands have already told you they cannot be trusted. And I sat there a while longer, with my palms flat against my knees, waiting for the shaking to pass, the way you wait out weather, without trying to hurry it, because trying to hurry it had never once worked for anything else in my life. Eventually, it did pass. Not quickly, not completely, not that first night, but enough that I could stand and turn off the bulb above the bench and walk back across the dark yard toward the house, past the hives already settled for the night, past the place in the fence where Bram's tire tracks were still visible in the frost, beginning to form along the gravel. Opal had left the porch light burning the way she always did when she went up before I came in, and I stood on the bottom step for a moment with my hand on the rail, and I did not go inside right away. I only stood there in the cold, in the dark, letting the last of it move through me before I let anyone else see what remained. The call came at 7:40 in the morning, 3 days after the night in the bee shed, while I was standing at the kitchen counter with my second cup of coffee going cold in my hand. Opal answered before I could reach the phone myself, and I watched her face change, the specific, unmistakable change of a woman receiving news she has been bracing herself to hear for so long, that its arrival reorganizes everything at once. "We're coming," she said into the phone. "We're coming right now." She hung up and looked at me, her hand still pressed against her chest. "She's awake, Earl," she said, and then caught herself, because that was not my name, had never been my name, and something in the slip told me more about how exhausted she had become over these last several days than any sentence could have. "Solomon. She's awake. She's been asking for you." I do not remember most of the drive to the hospital. I remember the morning light coming in flat and gold through the windshield, and Opal's hand on my arm the entire way, gripping hard enough that I could feel each of her fingers individually. And I remember thinking absurdly of the drive home from this same hospital 34 years ago, Corinne, 5 days old, wrapped in a yellow blanket, her small face screwed up against the daylight, as though she already had opinions about the world she had just arrived in. The nurse at the second-floor station smiled, the moment she saw me come through the stairwell door, already standing, already reaching for the phone to page the room. "She's been asking for you, Mr. Vance," she said. "Room 214. Go on back." Corinne was sitting up when I came through the door, not fully propped against a bank of pillows, her bandaged arms resting on the blanket in front of her. The bruising along her jaw faded now to a dull yellow-green at the edges. But her eyes were open brown and clear, and entirely unmistakably hers, and they found me the moment I stepped into the room and did not let go. "Dad," she said. One word, her voice hoarse and rough-edged from days of disuse, and it landed in my chest with the weight of everything I had been carrying since a phone had rung in the middle of the night. I crossed the room in 4 steps and sat carefully on the edge of the bed and put my arms around my daughter, mindful of the bandages, mindful of the IV line still running from the back of her hand. And she brought her good arm up around my neck and held on with whatever strength 3 days of hospital rest had returned to her. "You know," she said, finally pulling back just far enough to look at my face. It wasn't a question. "Most of it," I said. "I found the petition, Corinne, Hamilton County. I know what you built, and I know you built it alone." She nodded slowly, and something in her expression was not quite pride, and not quite exhaustion, but some third thing living exactly between the two. "You always told me," she said, her voice steadying as she found the words, "that bees don't panic when the weather turns bad. They just keep marking the way home one trip at a time and trust that the path holds even when they can't see the whole thing at once. I used to think that was just something you said to sound wise in front of your hives. I remember telling you that. I said. You were maybe 10. You'd gotten stung and you were furious at the entire hive. I believed it eventually," she said. "I held on to it more than you probably ever knew. Every time I documented something, every time I told myself just one more entry, just keep marking the path, I was thinking about that. I did it the way you taught me, Dad. Document first. Build something nobody can argue away. Don't move until you have what can't be undone." I had to look away for a moment out the window at the flat gray Tennessee sky, because I did not trust my own face to hold steady. The bruising had faded more than I expected in just 3 days, the yellow-green along her jaw giving way to something softer, and the shaved patch on her scalp. Its neat row of dark sutures was already starting to look less like an injury and more like the ordinary business of healing. I found myself cataloging it the way I had cataloged everything else these past days, evidence, progress, proof of a direction things were finally moving in, because it was easier to hold on to facts than to hold on to the fact of how close I had come to never hearing her voice say my name again. "There's something else," she said, and something in her tone shifted, sharpened the voice of a woman about to hand over the last and heaviest piece of what she had been carrying. "Something that isn't in the petition. Something I never told anyone, not even the lawyer who filed it." I turned back to her. 3 weeks before it happened, she said, I started recording him. Not constantly. I couldn't risk him finding a phone running all the time. But when I could feel a bad night building, when I knew the way weather changing, I'd set an old phone on the kitchen counter face down and press record and just let it run while I went about the evening like nothing was different. "How many recordings?" I said, my voice coming out steadier than I had any right to expect. 4, she said. "Over about 3 weeks. The last one is from the night it happened. He was on the phone with someone I couldn't hear the other end, but I could hear every word he said. All of it." "Where are they now?" I asked. "Cloud storage," she said. "Under an account I made using my maiden name. Corinne Vance. Bram doesn't know that name exists anymore, hasn't heard anyone call me that in 9 years. I looked up the law before I ever pressed record, Dad. Tennessee is a one-party consent state. I was always in the room. Every single recording is legal. I stared at my daughter, 34 years old, propped up in a hospital bed with bandaged arms and a voice still rough from disuse, and felt something enormous settle into place in my chest, cold and clear and absolutely certain. "I need to call Agent Ray," I said. "I know," she said. "But Dad." She squeezed my hand hard enough that I felt her knuckles. "I need you to know I didn't wait to tell you this because I doubted you. I waited because once you had it, I knew you wouldn't stop moving until it was finished. And I needed to be awake for that. I needed to be part of finishing it myself. You are," I told her. "You have been the one finishing it this entire time. I am only the man who finally caught up." Agent Ray called me at 6:11 the next morning. Before the sun was fully up, her voice clipped and efficient, in a way that told me she was already moving, already somewhere other than a desk. "We're executing this morning," she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me before you heard it from anyone else. We have the recordings, the financial records, the petition, the medical documentation, the witness statements. Judge signed the warrant late last night. We're not waiting." "Where?" I asked. "His office," she said. "The district attorney's building. We're taking him there rather than his home on the record in front of witnesses who work for the county and answer to state authority rather than Sergeant Holloway's chain of command. It removes any question later about whether local law enforcement had a chance to interfere before charges were properly filed." I asked why his office specifically, rather than simply arresting him wherever he happened to be found. "Optics matter in a case like this," she said. "If we take him quietly at home at 6 in the morning, there's no institutional record of the moment, nothing county employees themselves witnessed with their own eyes. Taking him at his desk in front of his own colleagues means there is no version of this story that any of them can later claim not to have understood clearly." I asked if I could come. "No," she said, not unkindly, but with the flat certainty of a woman who had made this call 100 times before, and did not intend to relitigate it with a grieving father at 6 in the morning. "You've done more than enough, Mr. Vance. Let us finish it clean. I'll call you the moment it's done." She called back at 8:57. "I want you to hear how it actually went," she said. "Because you earned hearing it right, not secondhand from a newspaper 3 days from now." She told it to me like this: 4 agents' unmarked vehicles arriving at the district attorney's office in downtown Sequatchie, a few minutes before 9, walking through the front doors together, rather than splitting up badges out, moving with the unhurried, deliberate pace of people who had done this before and did not need to rush to make their authority understood. The receptionist froze mid-sentence on a phone call, Ray said. Just stopped talking, phone still against her ear, and every person in that front office turned to look at us at exactly the same moment, like we'd walked into a photograph instead of a room. One of the paralegals actually stood up out of her chair, without seeming to realize she'd done it. Bram was in his own office, second door down a hallway, lined with framed certificates, and he looked up when the door opened and understood, apparently within about 2 seconds, exactly what was happening and exactly why arguing about it would accomplish nothing. Ray said he did not raise his voice. He did not reach for anything. He stood, buttoned his jacket out of some reflex toward dignity that Ray said she found almost sad to witness, and asked only one question before they walked him out. "Did she wake up?" he asked. Meaning Corinne. "She's awake," Ray told him. "She's the one who gave us the recordings." Ray said something moved through his face at that. Something she couldn't fully name. Not shock exactly, more like the last piece of a structure finally settling after everything holding it up had already given way days earlier. Dean Holloway showed up 11 minutes later. Ray said, having apparently gotten a call from someone inside the building the moment agents walked through the front door. He tried to assert jurisdiction, tried to argue that any matter involving a county employee should route through county channels first, as a professional courtesy. I informed him that state authority supersedes county courtesy when a signed warrant is already in hand, and that if he wanted to file a formal complaint about procedure, he was welcome to do so through the appropriate channel in writing after we had already left the building with our suspect. What did he do? I asked. He stood in the parking lot and watched us load Bram into the vehicle, Ray said. Didn't say another word. I imagine he understood better than most people in that building exactly how thin the ice under his own feet had just gotten. I stood in my own kitchen, holding the phone Opal beside me with one hand pressed flat against her mouth, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. There's one more thing, Ray said. Standard procedure once charges like this are filed, we open a broader review. Every prior report connected to that address, every officer who touched those files, every supervisor who signed off on closing them without proper follow-up. Sergeant Holloway is going to have a very difficult several months ahead of him, Mr. Vance, and I suspect he understands that better than anyone standing in that parking lot this morning. Thank you, I said, though the words felt entirely too small for what they were meant to hold. Thank your daughter, Ray said, and thank a 12-year-old boy with a beekeeping notebook. This case closed as cleanly as it did because 3 different people independently refused to stop keeping a record long before any of us in law enforcement ever got the chance to help. She was quiet for a moment on the line. That's rarer than you'd think, she said. Most cases like this, by the time we're called in, there's nothing left but memory and bruises that have already faded past the point of proving anything. You gave us a paper trail nobody could argue with. That's the whole case right there. That's what convicts a man like this, not outrage. Paper. I asked her what happens next, practically speaking, for Corinne, for Emmett, for the family going forward. Formal charges get filed today, she said. Aggravated assault at minimum across multiple incidents, plus the evidence tampering related to the hospital records and the asset concealment tied to the divorce filing. There will be a bond hearing. There will be eventually either a plea or a trial. And given what you've handed us, I would be surprised if his attorney lets this go to trial at all. In the meantime, your daughter and grandson are going to need you steady, Mr. Vance, more than they've needed you at any point so far. The hardest part of a case like this isn't always the arrest. Sometimes it's the year that comes after it. I looked across the kitchen at the notebook still sitting on the table where I had left it 3 nights earlier. The word Bram written across the top of the first page in my own hand, 14 pages of documented fact filling everything beneath it, and understood that Agent Ray was right about more than she probably realized. It had never been outrage that got us here. It had been the simple, stubborn refusal by everyone involved to let the truth stay unwritten. 10 months is enough time for a great deal to change, and enough time for almost nothing to change at all, depending entirely on what part of a life you're looking at. Bram pled guilty in March to 4 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of evidence tampering rather than let any of it reach a jury. His attorney negotiated the plea down from what the state had originally filed, but not by much and not enough to keep him out of Brushy Mountain. For what the judge made clear in a courtroom I sat in with Opal on one side of me, and Corinne still walking with a slight favor toward her left leg on the other, would be no fewer than 11 years. Dean Holloway resigned from the sheriff's department in April, 2 weeks before the state's broader review of his file closures was set to become public record. And word around Dunlap was that he had moved to be near a sister in Knoxville, though nobody I knew had confirmed it directly, and I had stopped being the kind of man who went looking for confirmation of things that no longer required my attention. Corinne moved back into the house with us in December along with Emmett, and by April, the 2 of them had settled into a rhythm that looked most days almost like an ordinary life if you didn't look too closely at the places where it still wasn't. She saw a counselor in Chattanooga every other Tuesday, a woman named Dr. Reyes, no relation to Marisol, an odd, small coincidence Corinne had laughed about the first time she mentioned it. the first real unguarded laugh I had heard from my daughter in longer than I wanted to count. Emmett still kept a notebook, though these days it held ordinary things again: hive counts, homework reminders, the box scores from the middle school baseball games he had started playing again that spring. It was late April when I finally opened the drawer in my workbench, where I had kept the old, cracked brood frame since the night I first took it down, all those months ago, and carried it out to the newest hive at the end of the row, the one I had started that spring from a swarm Emmett and I had caught together off a fence post, 2 counties over. Emmett found me out there working the family gathering behind us in the yard, where Opal had set up folding tables for the small cookout. We'd planned nothing large, just the 4 of us, and Otis and his wife and Marisol, who had become over these last months something closer to family than neighbor. "What are you doing?" Grandpa Emmett asked, watching me fit the old frame into the new hive box. "Giving this an honest job again," I told him. "It's been sitting on a shelf collecting dust for longer than it should have." "Isn't it too cracked to actually hold anything?" he asked. I looked at the crack, the same edge I had never once repaired in 40 years, worn smooth now by decades of handling, and thought about how to answer him honestly. "I used to think a crack like this meant something was finished being useful," I said. "That the smart thing, the careful thing, was to set it aside and wait until I had time to fix it properly before I trusted it with anything important again." I did that for 40 years, Emmett. Waited for a better moment that never quite arrived. And now he asked. "Now I think a crack just means something's been carrying weight for a long time," I said. "It doesn't mean it's finished. Sometimes the only way you find out whether a thing can still hold what matters is by giving it the chance to try." I set the frame into place, and it fit exactly as it always had, exactly as it had fit into a dozen hives before this one. Across 40 years of use, crack and all, and within a few minutes the first scouts from the swarm were already investigating its surface, unconcerned entirely with what I had spent so long deciding about its worthiness. Corinne came to stand beside me while Emmett went back to help Opal with the tables, and for a while neither of us said anything, watching the bees work the new frame in the mild spring light. "You still think about it," she said. Not a question. Every day, I told her, because I had decided somewhere over these last 10 months that lying to my daughter, even gently, even to spare either of us discomfort, was no longer a thing I was willing to do. I think about the 14 months I told myself I was being patient watching gathering, when really I was just waiting for someone else to make the first move so I wouldn't have to. "You came though," she said. In the end, that's what I remember. "I came late," I said. "You came," she said again. Firmer this time, and reached over to take my hand, her grip still slightly weaker on that side than it used to be. A fact the doctors had told us might always be true. Now one small, permanent reminder folded into an otherwise recovering life. That's what actually matters, Dad. Not how long it took you to get here. Just that you did, and that you didn't stop once you started. I did not fully believe her. Not completely. Not in the place where the 14 months still lived. Quiet and unresolved. A wound I had come to understand would likely never close all the way, no matter how much good followed after it. But I let myself believe enough of it to nod, and to squeeze her hand back, and to stand there beside my daughter in the late April light, while a swarm of new bees learned the shape of an old, cracked frame that had, after everything, turned out to still be exactly strong enough to hold what it was given. Behind us, Emmett's laugh carried across the yard. Opal was setting out a pitcher of tea, and somewhere beyond the tree line, the first real warmth of the season was settling over Dunlap, the way it settled every year at exactly this time, whether or not anyone below it had finished healing. "We made it!" Emmett called out to us, waving us over to the table. "Come eat. You two have been standing over there forever." Corinne looked at me and smiled, small and real and entirely her own, and we walked back together across the yard toward the rest of our family, leaving the bees to their new frame and their new season, and whatever came next. Late in the season, long after the last of the folding tables had been put away, the bee yard settles into its evening quiet, the way it always has, one dark shape after another, finding its way home through the narrow entrance of an old, cracked frame that nobody in the end ever got around to replacing. The light goes gold, then gray, then gone, and the hum inside the hive continues on regardless, steady, unbothered the way it always does, once the last bee is finally home. For most of my life, I believed that patience was its own kind of virtue, that a man who watched carefully enough, waited long enough, would eventually be handed the truth, without ever having to reach for it. I was wrong about that, or at least I was only half right. Patience matters. But I have come to understand that it only becomes a virtue the moment you're willing to move the second it tells you to. Waiting and standing still, it turns out, were never actually the same thing at all, and I spent far longer than I'm proud of confusing one for the other. What I carry now, more than the relief of watching justice finally arrive, is the memory of everyone in this story who refused to stay silent once they understood what silence was actually costing. A daughter who documented her own survival in secret. A grandson who found his own language for the truth when he had no other way to tell it. Neighbors and a doctor and a pastor, each of them choosing eventually to stop looking away. I believe God places the right people in a family's path at exactly the moment they're needed, even when it takes longer than any of us would have liked for those people to step forward. I believe he was in that hospital hallway. And I believe most of all that he was in a 12-year-old boy's decision to pick up a phone on the worst night of his mother's life. If you were standing where I stood, watching someone you love live with something you couldn't yet prove, would you have waited as long as I did before you moved? I'd like to hear your answer in the comments. Honestly, whatever it is, if this story found something true in you, share it with someone who needs to hear that patience is only worth what you're willing to do with it. And if you want more stories like this, stay close. There are more truths out there still waiting on somebody willing to write them down.